If it's just purely incidence without the term rate, then you can just use the formula number of new cases divided by total major population. But I usually use incidence density to avoid confusion when I also teach my students about this health indicators. If for cumulative incidence, this and incidence rate when you compare, there's strength limitation and appropriate use. You can have this on a table. So it's also important to take note with regards to this difference. So for cumulative incidence, it's easily calculated and understood since it measures risk. I would just like to answer my audio here. I'm using a different headset. Just a thumbs up if my audio is clear. Not that clear. How about for the others? No, for a while. So I'll just adjust.
How about for this one? Is it clear if I don't use my headset? Okay, actually, I'll just do this. Okay, again, with regards to the difference between cumulative incidence and incidence rate, you can take note of this table. For the strength, it's actually cumulative incidence is easier to calculate and understood since it measures risk. While incidence rate or incidence density, I'll just call it incidence density or person time rate, takes into account losses to follow up when disease occurs. Notice in the previous example that I gave, there's a part here where it indicates the sum of observation, disease, the sum of the years of observation. So that's actually part of it, because it takes into account also the follow-up and when the disease would occur. Limitation for cumulative incidence, it does not take into account losses. Take into account losses to follow-up or when disease would occur. I think this would be better audio. And for use, cumulative incidence is for fixed population with short follow-up or no losses to follow-up. While for incidence rate or incidence density is for dynamic populations where populations would have long follow-up times or substantial loss to follow up. So is there still an echo? Just tell me if it's still echo. So next thing that we would learn is on the secondary attack rate. Okay, so you just have to memorize or be familiar with the phrase, the probability that an infection occurs among susceptible persons within a reasonable incubation period. One thing that you would take note here, susceptible persons within a reasonable incubation period. Again, I will emphasize susceptible persons. For example, those who were not vaccinated, and then within a reasonable incubation period. Wherein you have this formula. So number of contacts developing the disease within the maximum incubation period. Of course, susceptible contacts here. To be more precise or complete with regards to definition, divided by the total number of susceptible exposed persons. So times 1,000. Because usually, the values are very low. So they would use the times 1,000. So you have to express this as the number of persons per 1,000 population. Let's have this example. If you have this, for example, COVID in light of the recent epidemic, you have here the primary number of confirmed cases or primary confirmed cases, and the number of susceptible persons with close contact tracing for each case. Okay. Maybe these are family members for the range of cases. But what is important here is the susceptible persons or the number of susceptible persons with close contact tracing to each of the primary case. And then the number of confirmed cases who develop, of course, with the symptoms of COVID-19 and which the environment for close contact. Can you calculate the secondary attack rate for each case or even for each environment for close contact? 2 minutes. You can just chat immediately. One can take the airport, one can compute for the household, one can compute for the establishments, secondary attack rate, one can compute for hospital, and one for the workplace. So your answer can be in per 1,000 population. 9.58 per 1,000 for the airport. Yes. What for the household? 14.48, yes, for the workplace. Hospital 15.39, yes, per 1,000. 31.3 for the household, yes. And how about for the establishments? Maybe someone computed for that. 14.25, yes, for the establishment. Disregard the percent here. This is a typographical error. Please disregard the percentage. This is per 1,000. Okay, so 9.5 per 1,000, 31.3 per 1,000, 14.25 per one. And I think there's a symbol with two circles in the bottom for the per 1,000 representation. But you can put it as per 1,000 in words. Next, another example. Consider an outbreak of typhoid in which 18 persons in 18 different households all became ill. If the population of the community was 1,000, then the overall attack rate was 18 over 1,000 as times 100% is equal to 1.8%. One incubation period later, 17 persons in the same household developed typhoid. If the 18 households included 86 persons, calculate the secondary attack rate. And if the 18 households included 86 persons, calculate the secondary attack rate. For this one, since it's just involves smaller numbers, you can have a percentage form or per 1,000 answer. You can accept in a percentage form or a per 1,000 answer for secondary attack rate for this problem. How about for the others? So what is important to take note here that there are 18 primary cases. So that's a primary attack, 18 persons, and a total of 86 persons in the household. You have to take into account for that before taking those numbers immediately. And then 17 persons develop the same symptoms of typhoid on that household. About for the others, what are your answers? Again, 86 persons and then 17 on the primary attack. You have to take that into account in computing for the secondary attack rate. No other answers. Remember in the previous examples, primary cases are already excluded in the number. Primary cases are excluded already in the number. What would maybe others have other answers? Okay, just chat your answers. There's no penalty for a wrong answer. Just keep on putting your answers. So I think the what is important here is one incubation period later, 17 developed typhoid. And if the 18 houses included 86 persons, calculate the secondary attack rate. Okay, let's go to the answer. The secondary attack rate was 25%. Was again, there were 18 initial cases for 18 persons. We have to deduct the primary attack or for the primary number of cases from the 86 persons total. Okay, so that would give you the 68 as your denominator. So since 17 developed new cases of typhoid, then divide it with 68. That's 100%, that's 25%. Or to the accept, I think 250 per 1,000. And the purpose there of the 1 times 1,000 in some of the formulas is to have a clear picture of the number of persons affected. So if the number is too small, then sometimes they transform it into a per 1,000. Or even in other measures, they transform it into per 100,000. So that would have a clearer picture. Instead of just putting 15%, for example. Of course, it's better to transform it into a per 1,000. Because just here, it's just 25 per 100 people. It's just clear, so you can use just the 25%. Next, our prevalence. Because the prevalence rate means number of old and new cases of a disease divided by the population during the same time period times the constant. So this is the probability that an individual belonging to the base population is affected by the disease or event. So it's equated to burden of the disease. If incidence is risk, then prevalence is equated to the burden of the disease. So it tells about who in the population has a given disease and those who do not have it, but does not tell us about the risk actually of getting the disease. So another example, which is easy to calculate. Prevalence. In a survey of 1,150 women who gave birth in Maine in 2010, a total of 468 reported taking multivitamins at least 4 times a week during the month before becoming pregnant. Calculate the prevalence of frequent multivitamin use in this group. You can just chat immediately. It's just easy to calculate for prevalence. It's just the total, old and new, actually, or all cases divided by the median population. Yes, prevalence is 40.7%. Since we have 2 hours for this morning. So again, incidence equated to risk, prevalence equated to burden. When you are a public health physician or a community physician and planning a health program, you consider actually the acuteness and even chronicity of cases. For chronic and communicable diseases, use prevalence indicator as basis for program planning and intervention. But for acute conditions, use incidence to establish implications or causation. So this is also important to take note of. Who knows, there might be a question related to this. So of course, for chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, you can use prevalence, the indicator. But for example, acute respiratory infections, you can use the incidence to establish implications or causation. So next, let's go to measures of fertility, which these are the examples: crude birth rate, total or general fertility rate, or age-specific birth rate. For crude birth rate, it was just the number of resident live births for a specific geographic area during a specific period of time divided by a total population and then multiplied by 1,000. Actually, for most of the measures that I am discussing, we have that 1,000 as a constant. Okay, so CBR is the number of registered live births in a year divided by the mid-year population times 1,000. Why do you think this is called crude for this measure? Why do you think this is called crude? Or what is something wrong actually? There's a detailed person or a meticulous person, you would see the drawback of this formula. Yes, due to the mid-year population. Can someone expound also? What is the problem if you just use mid-year population? Yes, actually, it's the mid-year population instead of women who are the ones capable of giving birth. And even it's not all women that could give birth. Of course, you have to take into account the reproductive age years of women also for you to have that better assessment of the fertility measures. Yes, not account age. So again, crude because the total population is represented in the denominator as the population at risk, or the population at risk of giving birth to a live neonate. So this is actually poorly represented by that denominator. So actually, it could be affected by demographic distribution of the population in the denominator, especially by sex and age, and also by race or ethnicity category and other demographic characteristics. What is better is this one. So for fertility measures, it'd be the general fertility rate would be the most commonly used overall fertility measure because it takes into account the number of registered live births in a year divided by the mid-year population of women 15 to 49 years old times or still 1,000. Okay, how about for this one? Can you answer? Region Z has a total of 200,000 live births in a calendar year of 2020 among residents of 2 million females aged 15 to 49. Population estimated for July 2020. What is the general fertility rate? Express your answer in per 1,000 female population or residents. What is the GFR or general fertility rate for this case? Europe is very fast no? in computing for the answers. Yes, it's 100 live births per 1,000 female residents aged 15 to 49 years old. There's a more specific measure such as the age-specific birth rate. Like if you want to take into account the 15 to 19 only, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, just have to count the number of registered live births per or in that specific age group. Instead, divided by the total number of women of the same age group times 1,000. So this actually shows differences in the capability of each group to give birth. Next would be the mortality frequency measures, which are the examples for like age-specific mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, even proportionate mortality rate, and case fatality rate. We also have actually crude death rate, CDR. This is the mortality rate from all causes of death for a population. So this is the number of deaths in the calendar year divided by the mid-year population. If you want to know the specific mortality rate of a specific cause, then you have the specific mortality rate or cause-specific mortality rate. This is from a specified cause of death from a population. So the numerator here is the number of deaths attributed to that specific cause or even a specific disease. And then the denominator remains the size of the population, the midpoint of the time period. And then still times 1,000. You want to, again, specify in a specific population, for example, specific death rates for males, then you can have this formula, like the number of deaths among males in a specific time divided by the mid-year population of males in a time period times 1,000. Or if it is a specific disease, then you have to take into account the number of deaths due to that disease, such as the example here for TB. In a specific time, then still divided by the mid-year population in a time period times 1,000. What do you think is the leading cause of death in the Philippines? We can chat your answers for your idea. What do you think is the number one cause of death in the Philippines? It might be a question actually in Prevent, so be ready also to know that answer. Yes, so most of you mentioned ischemic heart diseases. How about for number 2? Do you know what's the second one? And the number 3, for you to have an idea. Yes, you have the ischemic heart disease. This is 2017, but I think this still holds true for the current, for the past years. But the number 2 is neoplasm, and number 3 is cerebrovascular diseases such as the stroke. Included here, pneumonia, diabetes, hypertensive diseases, chronic lower respiratory infections. TB is just on the number 8. Then other heart diseases, and then remainder diseases of the genitourinary system. There could also be age-specific mortality rate. Of course, it's limited to only a particular age group. And the numerator here is the number of deaths in that age group, and then the denominator is the number of live births. Again, the denominator is the number of live births in the same period of time, or the number of persons in that age group in the population times 1,000. So you can even have actually a specific subset of the population, such as the infant. So infant mortality rate. So what is the age range, or what's the time coverage of infant? Up to what? Infant is defined as what? It lives to 1 year old. So infant mortality rate is perhaps the most commonly used measure for comparing health status among nations. So it might be a question also, like what is the most common measure for comparing health status among nations? So your answer could possibly be infant mortality rate. So this is number of deaths under 1 year of age in a year divided by number of live births in the same year. So this is generally calculated on an annual basis and reflects actually the health of the mother and infant during pregnancy and the year thereafter. So actually this reflects a wide variety of factors. That's why it's a commonly used measure, including access to prenatal care, balance of prenatal maternal health behaviors, and even postnatal care and behaviors, and even sanitation and infection control. But this was from 2018. We have here the global infant mortality rate of 28.9%. Southeast Asia still actually relatively high, but with the highest infant mortality in Africa, 51.82%. But among in Southeast Asia, what do you think? What country do you think is the highest or has the highest infant mortality rate? Among those in Southeast Asia, which country do you think has the highest infant mortality rate? You can chat your answers. Some would say Philippines, or which country in Southeast Asia? So actually, it's Burma, but it's an old name. What is the newer name for this one? Philippines, Myanmar as the highest infant mortality rate, and that's 2019. Actually, Philippines were in the top 5, what, 5th position. But for our country, actually, there's a decrease. Although we're in the top 5, but there's a decreasing trend. Actually, from the infant mortality rate from 2009 to 2019. And if you're gonna compare across countries, although still relatively high, but of course we would want to achieve a lower infant deaths per 1,000 live births, such as these are more advanced countries, for example, Japan, Korea. And then neonatal mortality rate. This covers birth up to, but not including 28 days. Numerator of the neonatal mortality rate, therefore, is the number of deaths among children under 28 days during a given time period as shown in this formula. So the denominator would be the number of live births in the same year times 1,000. Okay, next, we have the post-neonatal mortality rates. This is the period from 28 days of age up to now, but not including 1 year of age. The denominator here is the number of live births reported during the same time period. So to clarify, this 28 days up to less than 1 post-neonatal mortality rate. We also have the maternal mortality rate. So actually, a ratio used to measure mortality associated with pregnancy. So numerator here is the number of deaths during a given time period among women while pregnant, or just take note of this time period within 42 days of termination of pregnancy, irrespective of the duration and site of the pregnancy, from any cause related to aggravated by the pregnancy or its management, but not from accidental or incidental causes, which shows here the formula. The number of deaths due to pregnancy, delivery, perineum in a year, divided by the number of live births in the same year times 1,000. Although there are a lot of formulas here, but actually you can just see, can just be easily calculated by just dividing the number of that specific measure and then divided by total deaths in a year. And then multiply it by 1,000 also for the constant. For example, if you want to know like the number of deaths and from motor vehicular accidents, and you can use the proportionate mortality. Actually, there's a question. Actually, for infant mortality rate, it's more of a general measure. And then, actually, the definition of infant mortality rate is infant death, actually under 1 year of age, but can be further classified as neonatal, 0 to 28 days, and post-neonatal. So if you really want to have a specific measure during the post-neonatal period, which is under still infant mortality, then you can use that specific measure for post-neonatal mortality rate. And then for neonatal, of course, neonatal mortality rate at 0 to 28. It's just a subset for these two, neonatal and post-neonatal, a subset of the infant mortality rates. So in this example, maybe you could calculate or answer this. In 2001, a total of 5,000 motorcycle deaths occurred among males, and 1,800 deaths occurred among females. The estimated 2001 mid-year population in the region for males and females were 10.2 million and 12,484,000 respectively. Express the answer, since it's a very small number, express the answer in per 100,000 population. So first is calculate the motorcycle related deaths for males and females. Maybe answer that first. But the second question, just a heads up, is what type of mortality rates did you calculate? And then calculate the ratio of motorcycle mortality rates for males compared to females. Express per 100,000. You have the correct answer, but you can transform it to per, because it's 0.49 is not readily understandable by all. Although you are correct to have that 0.49, but if it's per 1,000, but the instruction mentioned per 1,000. Yes, it's 49,000 per males per 100,000 population and 14 per 100,000 female population. So what type of mortality rates did you calculate? Do you think what type of mortality rates did you calculate? Or maybe you can answer first. What is the ratio for males and females for this motorcycle mortality rates? Can you calculate the ratio for the motorcycle mortality rates for males compared to females? Yes, it's around 3 point plus. Males is to females. Or 3.4 to 1. You take into account the all numbers, even including the decimal. These are actually cause and sex-specific mortality rates. Next, Swaroop's index might come out also. This is the number of deaths among 50 years and older in a given year, divided by the total deaths in a year times 100. Actually, the higher the Swaroop's index, the better the health in the population. Actually, this is also used to compare even health status among countries. So not the most common, but it can also be used to compare between countries. Why do you think the higher the Swaroop's index, the better the health in the population or even the whole country? Sometimes it's actually the question might just be asking if you really understood the formula or the concept. Anyone? Why do you think? Yes. Lee. Lee. Very good answers from all of you. Meaning the deaths are actually coming from the older age group and not the young. So you are actually living the life expectancy, as mentioned also by Priela, to higher life expectancy and death occurs in elderly than in the younger population from by Roby. Very good. The next case fatality rate. This is the proportion of persons with a particular condition or case who die from that condition. This is actually a measure. If you have to memorize, this is the one measure of severity of the condition. It's the number of deaths by that case divided by number of all cases times 100%. Like for example, for this one, in an epidemic of dengue in Province Z, a total of 5,525 cases were identified. A total of 59 patients succumbed to dengue severe and died. What's the case fatality rate? You can use the 100%, but this is a very small number. Again, we can also express it into 1 per 1,000. You can have a percentage, but it's a very small number. For percentage, you can also express for this case in per 1,000. Okay, 1.07%. Yes, it's just relatively small actually, but there ideally should be lower or no fatalities as an aim for dengue. 1.67% or 10.67 per 1,000 population. How about for example rabies? What do you think is the case fatality rate? If you're gonna compute whatever data you will get from whatever country or whatever region or whatever province, what's the case fatality rate of rabies? Might also be a question. Or can you put in numerical form? Okay, 100. About for the others? 100% or be near 100%, like 99.999 or 99.99% case fatality rate for rabies. Just nice to know, actually, there were persons who survived rabies without the vaccine that could have attributed for the 0.001 survival. It's actually, if you want to read, it's more on Milwaukee protocol, but it's not without intervention, obviously. Someone or a few would survive rabies even without the vaccine. But of course, they had to do or give an antiviral for that protocol, the Milwaukee protocol. I think I already showed this for the number one morbidity. It's more of respiratory infections. But for infants, these are actually the 10 leading causes. Pneumonia is number one. Sepsis, second, and third is respiratory distress, the newborn. Next are age dependency ratio or age dependency ratio. Equal the number of people younger than 15 and older than 64 years old divided by the number of people working in age population, 15 to 64 times 100%. To compare among countries, the data shown here is the proportion of dependents per 100 working age population. Is this a problem if you have a high dependency ratio exhibited by some, actually even Philippines? Is this a problem if you have a high dependency ratio? Or what does it indicate if you have a high dependency ratio? Anyone? What does it indicate if you have a high dependency ratio? None? Actually, to save time. It indicates that the economically active population and the overall economy actually face a greater burden to support and provide the social services needed by children and even by older persons who are often economically dependent. That's the basis of the age range. Decisions to address health problems are founded upon information about diseases, risk factors, interventions, and even how outcomes of this is just in relation to the age dependency ratio. Again, the economy or even the country or the government might have to address more if you have more of the dependents. I think that's all. We'll proceed to some of the epidemiology concepts for 1 hour. I'll need to emphasize. But first, just a practice quiz. All of you who maybe some are already sleepy. Let us have this interactive game first to wake you up. This is more on the health indicators that SH and enter the game code. And go to quiz.sh and enter the game code. There will be 2 minutes to join. Again, this is just a practice. While you're entering for the rules, you can just select from the 4 choices. So there's a question. So it's a multiple choice question. Then select the correct answer. There are regular questions. So you just have immediately key in your answer for regular questions. But for buzzer questions, again, for buzzer questions, you need to buzz in first before you can answer. Then for buzzer questions, we have to be the one to buzz in first among the 300, for example, or 100 plus participants joining here for you to be able to have the chance to answer. Of course, you have to correctly key in the answer within 10 seconds. Just remember this game code if ever we'll be starting and someone would be disconnected or some others would want to join the last 10 seconds. I just place the game code if you want to join pa. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's start. What is the third sustainable developmental goal of 2030? What is the third sustainable developmental goal of 2030? A. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being. B. Partnerships for the goals. C. Promoting responsible consumption of medicines. D. Fighting gender inequalities. Let's do it faster. The answer: ensure healthy lives and promote well-being. Okay. BDCL, best player. You have to key in fast. There's additional points if you key in faster your answer. That's why the basis for the best player here. Question 2. An indicator is prioritized or scored by the WHO if it meets the following criteria. An indicator is prioritized or scored if it meets the following criteria by the WHO. I can just read the choices, but I'll emphasize the questions. It's A strong track record. Ola, best player. Next, question 3. This is the relative magnitude of two quantities, A census, B ratio, C rate, D proportion. This is the relative magnitude of two quantities. Answer ratio. A lot of you got the correct answer. Many of you are ready. The third bed at least. Question 4. This encompasses disease, injury, and disability. This encompasses disease, injury, and disability. A morbidity, B mortality, C population health, D demographics. And this encompasses disease, injury, and disability. First correct answer is morbidity. So we got it. Next. This is a buzzer question, so you have to buzz in first. Someone should buzz in first before answering. The top leading morbidity in the Philippines. AC. What's your answer? The top leading morbidity in the Philippines. A. Acute respiratory infection. B. Hypertension. C. Diarrhea. D. Diabetes. Key. The remaining choices, please key in your answer. E. coli. What's your answer? CDB. Okay. Yes, acute respiratory infection. There's a deduction if you key in the wrong answer in the buzzer question. There's a deduction if you key in the wrong answer in the buzzer question. These are the top 3. JJJ, Future License Doc, and JDCL. So far. Question 6. The probability that an individual belonging to the risk population or belonging to the at-risk population is affected by the disease of interest during a specified period of time. Is the probability that an individual belonging to the at-risk population is affected by the disease of interest during a specified period of time. Answer is incidence. For your last 10 seconds. The next question 7. This type of incidence does not take into account losses to follow-up when disease occurs. This type of incidence does not take into account losses to follow-up or when disease occurs. A. Case fatality, B. Cumulative incidence, C. Incidence density, D. Morbidity proportion. The answer is B. Cumulative incidence. That's player A. The next question 8. A buzzer question. The probability that an infection occurs among susceptible persons within a reasonable incubation period after known contact. You have to key in your answer, Riley, Reed, with an infectious person in household or other close contact environment. MD. What's your answer? Key in your answer. CDB. Only 2 left, secondary attack rate or primary attack rate? Secondary attack rate. A actually is now leading latest tally. Next, question 9. The probability that an individual belonging to the base population is affected by the disease or event. Disregard the what's up. The probability that an individual belonging to the base population is affected by the disease or event. Mortality, prevalence, incidence, or morbidity. Correct answer. Well, no, prevalence. JV, best player. Continue. Question 10. There's a lot of questions here. Good birth rate is affected by the demographic distribution of the population in the denominator, especially by A, sex and age, B, race and social status, C, occupation and social background, D, height and weight. Good birth rate is affected by the demographic distribution of the population in the denominator, especially by. Actually, this question would test how you understood the concept or the formula. That's why I asked it a while ago. So it's affected by sex and age. AK, best player. Question 11. It's a buzzer question. So someone should buzz first. Most commonly used overall fertility measure because it matches the readily enumerator and denominator data in a broad age range that covers most female reproductive years. Most commonly used overall fertility. Be careful. It takes into account female reproductive years. FP. You were listening, yes. General fertility rate. Next, question 12. Still a buzzer question. The country with the highest infant mortality in 2019. It might be still this day. Country with the highest infant mortality, yes, CDB. I think CDB is now leading. 4,746. Myanmar is the correct answer. Question 13. Neonatal mortality rate covers birth up to. Neonatal mortality rate covers birth up to less than 28 days, exactly 28 days, or 28 days to 1 year, 28 days up to 5 years. I even explained when someone asked with regards to specific infant mortality rates. With less than 28 days. Yum, best player. And 14, a buzzer question. So the number of deaths among 50 years and older in a given year divided by the total deaths in a year times 100. What is this measure? The number of deaths among 50 years and older in a given year divided by the total deaths in a year times 100. Yes, it's Warup's index. Good enzyme. Last question. It's the regular question. Estimates the risk of pregnant women of dying from pregnancy-related causes. This is very easy. Estimates the risk of pregnant women of dying. Maternal mortality rate. That's for AA. So let's see who's the top 5 among you. Congratulations, JJJ. 5th place. 4th place, CPL. 3rd place, AA. 2nd place, CDB, was overtaken by A. Congratulations, who's this A? That's 6,000. That's it. Want more? I don't have G. One thing that you just have to remember is the study of distribution and determinants, and then its application. The distribution and determinants of health, and then its application to the problems. The goal of epidemiology is to harvest valid and precise information about the causes, preventions, and treatments for disease. You don't have to memorize, but these are the 7 landmarks in the history of epidemiology. Hippocrates, known as the father of medicine, and actually was considered informally as the first epidemiologist because he studied the environment and human behaviors and how it affects health. Actually, he's the first person known to have examined the relationships between the occurrence of disease and again environmental influences. Actually, during that time, Hippocrates believed sickness of the human body to be caused by imbalance of the four humors: air, fire, water, and earth. And the cure to sickness was to remove or add the humor in question. So actually, this belief led to the application of bloodletting, actually, and even dieting in medicine. Don't have to memorize each one, but I'll just highlight. William Farr is the one who established application of vital statistics for the evaluation of health problems. But you don't have to, I could have shown you the story of Jon Snow, not the one in Game of Thrones, but the one who tested the hypothesis on the origin epidemic of cholera. As he actually revolutionized steps of scientific investigation. And without that steps in investigation, or even actually formalized the field of epidemiology through the steps that he made. He would not be able, the medical society during that time would not be able to discover to the cause of the epidemic without the great contribution of Dr. John Snow. Actually, during that time period, what do you think is the predominant theory? It might be a question in Prevment. What is the predominant theory? Disease causation theory, believed by people during that time, even the medical field. What was the predominant disease causation theory? Anyone know? Not yet the germ theory. Because the germ theory would somehow explain still the cause. Was the what they believed during that time is actually far from the explanation of cholera. So you also have to, as a tip, study on disease causation theories. It might come out also in the Prevent exam. Germ theory could be one of that disease causation theory. That's actually the miasma theory. I don't know if you're familiar with miasma theory. I don't know if it has been emphasized in your PCM in your undergrad. Yes. Um, Diseases during that time, even before the time of Dr. John Snow, they believed that disease was caused by inhaling this bad air called miasma. And that would actually, after inhaling that, it would show the signs and symptoms of the disease. And in that time, the cholera, they explained that it was miasma, what's as the cause of cholera. And Dr. John Snow was so persistent in disproving that theory. Okay. And during the 1937, it was Bradford Hill who suggested a criteria for establishing disease causation. Okay, so again, there's the cause then effect or causation of the disease or something that could explain why this disease developed. Epidemiological thought emerged in 460 BC or maybe in the time of Hippocrates, but it flourished as a discipline in the 1940s. And during this time, it was formulated with regards to Bradford Hill's criteria of causation. So he was actually an English statistician. He proposed the set of 9 criteria. Actually, the 10 is just added to formalize the disease causation criteria. A set of 9 criteria to provide epidemiologic evidence of a causal relationship between a presumed cause and an observed effect. He even demonstrated the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. So the list of the criteria is as follows, like strength of association. Just have to read further if you want to know more about the criteria. Strength of association, consistency, specificity, temporality, biological gradient. So temporality, just to emphasize that the effect has to occur after the cause or exposure. The biological gradient, and then for meaning greater exposure should generally lead to greater incidence or effect. plausibility, and then coherence, experiment, and analogy. There's a detailed description of the, don't have the time to mention, but again, just to, so you know, you have this set of criteria. Plausibility is meaning a plausible mechanism between cause and effect is helpful. In an experiment, occasionally it is possible to appeal to experimental evidence. For key features for epidemiology, all findings must relate to a defined population and oriented to groups rather than individuals. Some lectures, some lecturers would also differentiate community medicine or public health with clinical medicine. This is what are the main key features, and all other descriptions will just stem from these two key features. For epidemiologic approach, it actually answers the what, when, where, who, and why. And that is what John Snow did during his time in the epidemic of cholera. Epidemiologist is more likely to describe as to case definition nowadays: time, place, person, and cause. A case definition is a set of standard criteria for deciding whether or not a person has a particular disease or other health-related condition. So sometimes the terms probable, confirmed would arise because of that case definition. Using a standard case definition ensures that every case is diagnosed in the same way, regardless of when or where it occurred. The number of cases of the disease that occurred in one time or place can then be compared with the number that occurred at another time or place. If you're an epidemiologist, these are the most likely steps you have to do for an outbreak investigation. Actually, an outbreak carries the same definition of epidemic, but is often used for a more limited geographic area. But I would just like to ask also this question: how do you define an epidemic? Especially that we had COVID from 2020, and maybe just a few cases now in the Philippines. How do you define an epidemic? I just take note for this, for the steps. You don't have to memorize, but at least you're familiar what are the process that they have to go through. Anyone, how do you define an epidemic? Good, dumalanta. Number of cases in excess of normal expectancy. Out of proportion, yes, are for acceptable definitions, or increase in number of cases from the expected. For disease models, or like when you answer how do diseases develop, there are best three known models, but the most common is the epidemiological triangle. So this is an interaction of an agent and host in appropriate environment results in the disease. Again, it's an interaction of the triad: agent, host, environment. That's for the epidemiologic triangle. Next, web of causation. This is a complex interaction of factors results in the disease. And then the wheel model, there's the hub or host having a genetic makeup as its core, surrounded by an environment divided into biological, physical, and social. This might help you. You can visit the CDC website and read some of the lessons there to help you review. So many of the things that I discussed are also lifted from the CDC. There are practice quizzes also there that might be also helpful to you. But don't just focus on that. Again, Prevmed can be varied. There might be also questions on family medicine, like family assessment tools. There might also be questions on diseases, Example on diarrhea, for example. You have to also be strategic when you study also. So this is the triad, the epidemiological triad is the most common model. I think all our viewers are familiar, but maybe for the others might not be familiar with the web of causation. This is an example like how TB would develop. It's a web because there might be some factors interrelated that could predispose the patient to develop TB, for example, like overcrowding, malnutrition, and then exposure and develop infection and so on. Like this is just actually an expansion of the triad. And even for wheel of causation, it's just focusing on the host with its environment, like envirological, social, physical, and that interacts with the genetic core of the individual. These are the stages or the natural history of the disease. It's important that you are familiar with this. And since your exam is nearing, so I assume you have already read about it. Like what is stage of susceptibility, what is the stage of subclinical disease, in which there are pathologic changes, but there are no signs and symptoms yet. But once there's the onset of signs and symptoms, then you are already, or the patient is already in the stage of clinical disease. And this is the usual time of diagnosis. After that, with or without the intervention, there could be the recovery of the patient, or there could be a disability, or even death. So one of the common concerns are the infectious diseases. So it's also an important concept also in epidemiology with regards to the chain of infection and how do this infection are being transmitted, or what is the mode of transmission. So we are familiar with what is droplet transmission, direct contact, vector, vehicle, or airborne. And then of course there's the susceptible host in which it could have the organisms or the infection. How about for COVID-19? What was the mode of transmission? Do you think, or was there a question? What is the mode of transmission? COVID-19? Among this, what do you think? Is it one or could be several? The droplet was the most common and could be transformed into a yes. Okay, thank you for pointing it out. Could be aerosolized. It might come also as an airborne, especially in a closed space. Okay, so but primarily on the uh, droplet, but there could be several modes. So next, these are terms that you have also to be familiar. Like what is infectivity? You just have to remember the ability of an agent to invade. Pathogenicity, ability to set up a reaction. Those are just simpler terms that you have to remember. Pathogenicity meaning the again ability to set up a local or general reaction. Virulence, you just have to remember severity, because it's a measure of the severity of the reaction produced. And then antigenic properties, this is just more on the infectious agent. So this ability to stimulate the host to produce agglutinins, opsonins, recipients, and all other else, or even set up inflammatory reaction. These three are the most important you have to know or differentiate. There's also a concept on the effect of carriers on disease transmission. The carriers, as you all know, doesn't have the signs and symptom yet. Okay, so there's also that iceberg effect or theory or hippopotamus effect. Iceberg effect, if you are in a temperate zone, they use that theory, or hippopotamus effect in the tropical zone. So these are the fact that carriers constitute a hidden reservoir of infection and that they may outnumber actual cases and sometimes, or in some other cases, might cause an epidemic outbreak and then epidemic later on. Okay. So actually, the iceberg theory is the more common. Iceberg theory of disease is a metaphor, actually, portraying the idea that clinicians only see a minority of cases at any given diseases, which is the tip of the iceberg. So that's the basis for that. So for every case that comes to a clinician, there are likely to be many more people with preclinical disease in the community, which represents the vast submerged part of the iceberg. So that people, a number of people would have the maybe the vast number of those who are in the preclinical stage. Maybe that's what happened initially during COVID, for example, the early stages of the epidemic. There might just be a few number first, but there might be have more other people who have been infected and has yet to develop the signs and symptoms. Hippopotamus just the same because the hippopotamus is only a part of its body that you can see, and the vast majority of its body is submerged in the important thing. I think the common recurring question in the past medical board exams is on the definition of an incubation period. Okay, anyone, how do you define an incubation period? How do you define an incubation period? You can chat your answers. It might not be from year to year, but even I think from during our time, it was 2013 and 2016, and even the recent 2021, I think, has been asked with regards to incubation period. So yes, period of exposure to the onset of signs and symptoms. Always remember that. It's in MPL1, or you're sure with that one point. So next are some of the definitions you already defined. Epidemic. When I say endemic, it's a disease constantly occurring in a geographical area. The pandemic is an epidemic occurring within more than one country or territory. It's sporadic, occasional, or infrequent occurrence. Epizootic or enzootic diseases occurring in animals, and zoonotic diseases of animals transmissible to man. So for epidemics, or definition of an epidemic, we already again mentioned this. Any number of cases that is in excess of the normal expectancy. Let's discuss some of the curves because I think also some past questions involved asking about epidemic curves. The basic curves, I'll just show for the next two slides, and then the curves shown also in the CDC, I'll also describe. The epidemic curves, first is classical. There's a short ascending and long descending limbs. This is usually when you try to graph waterborne diseases. Like what? You might have a classical epidemic curve based on, for example, an epidemic of waterborne diseases. Like what? Cholera, of course, yes. What else? For example, epidemic of cholera, then it would result to a classical epidemic curve. Yeah, amoeba or amoebiasis. Or even diarrhea caused by E. coli. Even schistosomiasis can be considered. Next is the inverted, so the opposite to the classicals, long ascending but short descending. These are usually for vector-borne diseases such as what? So for these diseases, you expect an inverted epidemic curve like malaria. What else? Of course, dengue and all the mosquito-related diseases. Okay, like and also Lyme disease, for example, by the tick, I think, and Japanese encephalitis even. Next, the bell-shaped curve. There's equal ascending descending limbs, but the peak is rounded, usually for contact transmitted diseases like what are contact transmitted diseases? STIs. Aside from sexually related diseases, what else? Contact related diseases. Contact transmitted. Could be varicella. Yes, scabies is a good example. Even conjunctivitis, impetigo. Next is point epidemic curve. You have equal ascending and descending limbs also, but the peak is pointed. Cases of food poisoning. Actually, CDC has specified this point epidemic curves. So this is what I meant. I'll also discuss what is shown also in the CDC as a reference. So actually, this is a point epidemic curve, but it can the full name of this is point source epidemic curve or a point source outbreak with no propagation curve. Okay, so there's the exposure, then there's the development of the cases. It rise in a certain period of time. Then once these patients are able to recover, then of course it would still decrease also the number of cases. So here all cases appear to occur within one incubation period, suggesting that cases did not arise from person to person spread. Okay, so the fact that the outbreak was of short duration suggests that it was a single brief, hence point exposure that did not persist over time. Again, an example could be the food poisoning or even a diarrhea following the neighbor's fiesta, for example. You ate the same food, for example. Or respiratory illness would develop with this outbreak, point source outbreak. Next is the continuing source outbreak. As with the point source outbreak, a group of people are exposed to a single noxious influence. But here, the exposure continues over a long period of time or a longer time. So the outbreak persists for longer. Actually, here, the exposure continues. For example, a contaminated water supply that doesn't get fixed. So, of course, maybe, for example, diarrhea. There might be seepage of bacteria, for example, to the water supply, causing the diarrhea. So there's continued exposure from the residents, and then there would be continued case number rise and fall of the cases for continuing source. That's why from the hence the name continuing. So there's continued exposure. Next, there's also intermittent outbreak epidemic curve. You may occasionally see this pattern. This seems to be a common source that is not well controlled, actually. So outbreaks recur. Depending on the time frame, it could be seasonal or weather related, or perhaps due to a common source such as an industrial contaminant being emitted at intervals, so causing these outbreaks, intermittent outbreaks. The gaps between the outbreak might initially suggest person-to-person transmission followed by an incubation period, but this is unlikely because in a transmissible disease, the successive peaks would become larger and merge together as in the next example shown here. Before that, with regards to my previous example, like a pipe that has been broken or water source has been broken, might have been fixed initially, then broke again, then there's another outbreak, fixed again, and then broke again. So there's might be another outbreak. That could also be the reason. For the point source with index case and limited spread curve, here a single index case, for example, a returning traveler, infects other people and cases arise after an incubation period. So the outbreak wanes when the infected people no longer transmit the infection to other susceptible people, perhaps because of successful control measures. So the graph here suggests that the control measures were successfully done and achieved quite quickly. Next is propagated spread epidemic curve. So this begins like an infection from an index case, but then develops into a full-blown epidemic with secondary cases, infecting new people who in turn serve as sources for yet other cases. So this produces successively taller peaks, just like what happened also during the COVID pandemic, initially separated by one incubation period, but the peaks tend to merge into waves with increasing number of cases in each generation. So the epidemic continues until the remaining number of susceptible individuals declines or until intervention measures takes effect, such as, for example, vaccinations. So next, just additional information, the considerations in determining disease causation. Actually, the goal of epidemiological studies is to determine the relationship between an exposure and a disease with validity and precision using minimal resources. So meaning you have to take this into account, like what is validity? There's lack of bias and confounding factors. Bias is an error committed by the investigator in the design or the conduct that leads to a false association. Confounding is not the fault of the investigator. These are actually research concepts that we have learned, especially even in the from undergrad, but rather reflects the fact that epidemiologic research is conducted among few living humans with unevenly distributed characteristics. Or a confounding variable is a factor other than the one being studied that is associated both with the disease or the dependent variable and with the factor being studied or independent variable. A confounding variable may distort or mask the effects of another variable on the disease in question. And precision should be there's a lack of random error. Next few concepts for the next 15 minutes. What I would like to emphasize are the levels of prevention, especially when you are in the community or you are in the public health sector, or even epidemiologist who works also with on projects to develop interventions or especially preventive strategies that would address the health problems of the community, the province, society, or even the country. Okay, so there are these levels of prevention. What you commonly know are the three: primary, secondary, and tertiary. I just discussed this because there was one question in the past board exam, not the recent, but uh, it was maybe the batches after us. A question on primordial prevention. That's why I'll just include this. So this is actually the summary figure with regards to the level of prevention. When I say primary, it's preventing the onset of disease. But actually in primary prevention, there's already the risk factors or the population is already at risk. While in primordial, it's preventing the development of the risk factors. So in primordial, you are intervening as early as possible so that you will not develop the risk factor that can be addressed in primary prevention to prevent also the development of disease. Secondary prevention is early diagnosis and prompt treatment. That's the only thing that you have to remember. And tertiary prevention is to reduce complication and disability. Examples would now just stem from this short or highlighted definitions. Let's start first with primordial prevention. Actually, primordial prevention 6 prevent future disease by influencing its social determinants. It's the most recent addition to preventive strategies, what they call primordial. So it consists of risk factor reduction targeted towards an entire population through a focus on social and environmental conditions. Such measures typically get promoted through laws and national policy. So this is a very good example, laws and national policies. Again, it's intervening at the earliest possible. Even it's just for example, a school mandate not to eat junk foods and drink soft drinks during recess, or to not allow vendors to sell junk foods and soft drinks in the canteen or in the school. That's actually, although not really a law, but even just by that mandate alone, it could be an example of a primordial prevention, because you are preventing like children to develop that risk factors, for example, obesity, and prevent even further from developing those cardiometabolic diseases. And also another main intervention is health education, but as long as there's still no risk factor. Like as early as possible in schools, it is incorporated in the curriculum with regards to healthy eating. And these are actually just grade 1 or grade 2 children, and could be in the primordial prevention phase. So another example, like many adult health problems, obesity, hypertension have their early origins in childhood. This is a time when lifestyles are, so again, the mandate by not eating or not selling those junk foods and soft drinks is an example of the primordial prevention. Parents, teachers, and peer groups are actually important in imparting this health education also to children. For laws, it could be a national program and policies on food and nutrition, or comprehensive policies. Like for example, if there would be a law that would ban smoking everywhere, then that's our primordial prevention. But for now, it's just to ban smoking in specific areas, then still could be a primordial prevention. So the goal also is to make major changes in the lifestyle, and again, as early as possible. Well, your primary prevention can be defined as the action taken prior to the onset of disease. So again, here in primary, there's already the risk. Okay, so for example, 40-year-old male. So there's already the risk developed with the family history of diabetes. Then of course your strategies for although if he does not have diabetes yet, then your primary prevention would deal with, for example, diet that would prevent increase the blood sugar, then that could be a primary prevention. So again, it signifies intervention in the pre-pathogenesis phase of a disease or health problem. Again, remember just the difference here. There's already the risk, but no disease has occurred yet in primary prevention. But in primordial, there's no risk factor that has developed yet. We all know this information, examples for primary prevention. Still, health education can be part of it, but as long as there's already the risk. So educating that 40-year-old man, in my example, is part of primary prevention already, since he already has the risk. Other examples like immunization, prophylaxis, even waste management, those are some strategies. The next, secondary prevention. Don't have to discuss in detail, but just remember early diagnosis and prompt treatment. So what are examples of secondary prevention? Anyone? Or some examples of secondary prevention? Yes, screening tests are part of it because of the term early diagnosis. So that's perfect example for the early diagnosis and prompt treatment. So especially for secondary prevention, it's just for acute and acute diseases like UTI, pneumonia. Giving of antibiotics to UTI and pneumonia are just also another example. So it's an example of prompt treatment. So again, this is more applicable to acute or even subacute diseases, and in which you can just address it and cure it, and that's secondary prevention. Again, secondary prevention, complete cure, and prevent the progression of disease process is also the target. A question, uh, do all giving of medications or giving of medications is always a secondary prevention? Yes or no? An example of giving medications to address disease, is it always a secondary prevention? No. So that's one thing that you have to remember. Because secondary prevention, again, prompt treatment. So those that can still be addressed immediately and be cured. Again, complete cure. So when would it be 10 minutes to for you to answer this sample questions? It's already near your. These are just 10 questions. Try to gauge where you are now. But again, it's important that you know this PrevMed or community medicine, epidemiology, biostatistics, because these are questions that are repeating in the board exams. But for the other coverage, it will vary, like concepts on family medicine, concepts from IM, pedia, surgery, or OB even, or from your clinical subjects. But definitely, biostatistics research concepts will always or almost always included in exam. Okay, last 30 seconds. So, health indicators or statistics or even survey on your own and try to uh, analyze the results that you have gotten and identify the health problem of the community. But this is a regular collection already, an analysis, so an interpretations have been done, and you just need to assess maybe also the effectivity, the efficacy also of your intervention. Again, this is more of PubMed and not really just epidemiology. When plotting the epidemic curve, the following important considerations must be taken into account. When plotting the epidemic curve, the following important considerations must be taken into account, except just read na lang the choices. Correct answers. Others might be still questions with except, not. This is not a, this is the one, then except. Although this is not actually a recommended way of asking questions when you go to a masteral or when you're a teacher when you go to masteral, this actually is not recommended. But in the board exam, I've just included this because there will still be except and not questions. These are all regular questions, so don't worry. Which phase in community diagnosis wherein an interview is done? Which phase in community diagnosis wherein an interview is done? A, planning, B, data analysis, C, exploration, D, data collection. answer is data collection. Allopurinol, best player. So might be expert already in pharma. Because I'm also teaching pharmacology in med school. 4. What is the method of waste disposal wherein animal manures are subjected to combustion, producing methane, that's methane, to become a power source? So sometimes you just have to analyze the choices and you can get the answer. So of course, which of the resources involved with burning? It's easy to answer. Incineration. To subjected to combustion. That's your clue. Next question 5. Which is not a discrete variable? Which is not a discrete variable? A number of medical schools, B household size, C hospital bed capacity, D per capita income. Also another example where you can analyze a question even if you have not studied about it. This is another example of a question where you can analyze the choices. Per capita income. So remember, number of medical schools, household size, and hospital bed capacity have whole numbers. Even if you forget that what is a discrete variable, when you try to look at the choice, this might be meaning a set of fixed number. And per capita is could be point have decimal places in numbers. So this might be the answer. That's what I mentioned that is you can actually even a testmanship, that's a testmanship principle. But not everything, but at least there are questions you can get correct answers. Which is not a true, which is not true about proportion as a tool of demography. Which is not true about proportion as a tool of demography. A measures amount of change in population, B special type of ratio, C written in percentage, D numerator is part of the denominator. Correct answer is measures amount of change in population. Question 7. Which is not a characteristic of primary care. So questions could also revolve on primary care. So please study also on universal health care. For your PrevMed, study also on universal health care. It's not part of what's mentioned with PrevMed. It's limited by problem origin. So there could be wide range of cases. Since you are actually a first contact, comprehensive and coordinated care. Not be limited. And 8. The pathogenesis of diarrhea, where microbes cause damage in the epithelial cell surface, thereby producing grossly blood stool, is present or found in what infection? Pathogenesis of diarrhea, where microbes cause damage in the epithelial cell surface, thereby producing grossly bloody stool, is found in what infection? Salmonella. This is what I meant, that there could be questions from your IM, or even it's actually a microbiology related question, or even pathology. So again, expect also questions that there might be also clinical, but applicable to community medicine. Because in the community, diarrhea is common, and if you are a community physician and you have a patient with grossly bloody stool and you suspect, and even from other patients that you have in the community, you would suspect there might be a salmonella infection is common in the community. Question 9. What do you call this STD caused by Haemophilus ducreyi and presence of a painful ulcer in the glans penis? We call this STD caused by Haemophilus ducreyi, and I think Dr. is all fond of actually is giving you also some tips on remembering this key term and then associate with the disease. He's very much an expert on explaining this since I learned a lot from these key terms. Chancroid, I don't know, but I think he has mentioned this. The OI, painful. The chancre, just since there's no OI, it's painless. One that's painful is the chancroid. I could remember when I was still reviewing in CDB. Again, this is the wide range of questions that could appear or come out, even if it's somewhat less likely, but can still be asked. Because again, these are cases that can be seen in the community or even a public health concern. Last question. A worker applicant may be classified in this class after the pre-employment EE if found to be suffering from certain impairments like hypertension, requiring special placement or assignment, requiring periodic follow-up, but employable. This patient is cleared to work, but needs frequent follow-up and or special placement. Class A, B, C, or D? It's class C. Actually, this is more occupational medicine concept. It's actually the Philippine College of Occupational Medicine is affiliated to society of our society, which is the Philippine Academy of Family Physicians. There might be also questions on this. Class A is no problem, just fit and no other comorbidities. Class B is there's a existing disease but curable. Like for example, patient had UTI. You still have to clear him for work because UTI can just be cured in a week's time of antibiotics. You can put class B, you have that finding of UTI, and then you recommend antibiotics and then clear for work after a week. Class C is with comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes that would require frequent follow-up that is viable. And D is one thing that's difficult to clear because the comorbidities might be interfering with this work for class D. This is the one that you maybe refer to a subspecialist that would be the one to recommend, or do not clear this patient because of the, for example, heart failure. Of course, you would put it to the class D, and the work involves effort. We have to put as class D.